Today is the 10th of February, 2011. We are at the New York State Military Museum in Saratoga Springs, New York. My name is Wayne Clarke. Sir, for the record, would you please state your full name and date and place of birth, please?
Sure. My name is Jed Duvall, and I was born in Rockville Center, New York on May 5th, 1937. And I was christened James Edmund with a U, but I use my initials, JED, as my nickname and for just about everything but a new mortgage.
Okay. Did you attend school there?
I went to school in public school in Garden City, New York, from kindergarten through the 12th grade. And after that, I went to Duke University. And after that, I was in the U.S. Navy.
And what year did you graduate from Duke?
I was graduated from Duke in 1959 with a degree in business. A degree in business is what you took because you couldn't think of anything else.
And when did you go into the Navy?
Right on graduation. I was sworn in on the steps of the Duke Chapel with about 30 other guys, and in uniform, and then went right to Annapolis, Maryland, where I served as Special Services Officer at the U.S. Naval Station in support of the enlisted people who support the academy. The waiters, the guards, so on.
And what was your typical duty day?
Muster at 0745 and checking out ping pong balls, running the swimming pool, getting the bowling alley resurfaced, ordering movies, which we charged 10 cents for movies, running the barbershop where it was, I think, 15 cents for a haircut, stuff like that. It was laundry and morale. It was recreation and welfare for the troops.
And did you enjoy doing that?
Well, it was a day, a period in history when all males had to do something for their country, unless they wanted to cheat and get duck out on it. People did 6-month tours of this and that. People did 3-year tours. Other guys in the ROTC who were in contract were in the Navy for 3 years. That later became 4, their obligation under scholarship. But the contract people, the government didn't pay very much money to train me, and so I only owed them 2 years. And after 2 years, by that time I was married, we had kids, and I wanted out, and my wife wanted out as much as I did.
Okay. And you got out of the Navy, and what did you do next?
Well, I didn't know what to do. I thought for a while I would go sell shirts in New York, because that's what my older brother did, and I always did what he did. But my wife had worked in the news department of a station in Baltimore, WBAL, AM, FM, and TV. And she had worked in the news department. She said, why don't you go see the news director? So I did, and I was hired on the spot in 1961, when the qualifications for being a local newsman were pretty much to be a male, white, who was breathing. That has changed. News, television news, broadcast news, newspaper work has changed probably faster than almost any other industry in the country in terms of, other than white males, being allowed in, being paid highly, and getting to the top, and so on.
Now, did you go out on a daily basis with a camera crew? And
went out on a daily basis by myself with a handheld silent camera. At first I was given only little short reels of film that were unused on other projects, so I had 30, 40 feet of film, and I was supposed to learn how to shoot. I was given one crummy little 1-inch lens. I didn't have a full complement of lenses, so I went out and shot accidents mainly. Accidents and murder scenes and things like that, and came back in, and we processed the films ourselves. We edited the films ourselves, little edit things with glue and stuff on them, and 16mm black and white. It didn't go to color for several years. This was the early 60s. And a successful newscast was one in which the half hour, when the anchor would read something and go to a newsreel, a successful newscast was when the film didn't break. There was really no other measure, because if you went back on this now and looked at it in comparison with today's technology, I think you'd be really embarrassed at how simple this stuff was. But it was a great place to learn a lot of things, because I had a really solid newspaper man who had been brought over into broadcasting to teach us, and he was there working every day and every night, and he taught us how to write, he taught us how to cover, he taught us how to judge news stories. And that was really very, very good training for about 6 years. And after that, I really had an itch to go to the network, and I did. I got a job at CBS News in April of 1967. So I went to work in New York. Took a pay cut to go to a much more expensive city from Baltimore to New York, but it was worth it to get to the network.
Now, what did you do with CBS initially?
Initially, I was a clerk on the assignment desk. I didn't call it that. Call it assignment editor and associate producer. But really, I was just a clerk, so that they could see how well you handled routine news stuff for about a year. And then I was invited to go in the summer of '68 to the Los Angeles Bureau. And that's where I became more of a... then I got out into the field. And then I discovered I had to unlearn a lot of things I'd learned in local. And had to do things differently, judge things differently, see things in a different way, and put a lot more energy into things, actually. Learn to do that. And after a year and a half of that...
Now, how many people did you have underneath you?
Nobody.
No one? Just
I was
working as an independent.
Well, in Los Angeles, I was a reporter. And at the network, it didn't make any difference to anybody outside the network, but at the network, the important distinction was between being a reporter and a correspondent. If you were a correspondent, you were one of the princes. It had about 65 princes of the church. Charles Collingwood, Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather. Those were the princes. And the people working under them were reporters, trying to get to become correspondents.
I see.
And one of the ways you could get there was to go to Vietnam, do well. And if you did well in Vietnam, you came back as a correspondent. And as I say, it didn't make any difference to anybody out on the street, whatever. But within the company, that meant a lot. And that's what I did. I went to Vietnam for a year and a half.
Now, how did your family feel about that?
They went with me. They went with me. We had 4 kids, and the 2 older ones stayed home because they were teenagers. And Saigon was a sewer of dope for American kids. But the little kids were 9 and 10, and we took them with us.
So your wife went with you? And,
yes, she did.
And whereabouts did you live?
In Saigon.
And what kind of living quarters did you have?
And a very nice apartment. Very nice apartment that we paid for. We had 2 maids, which made my wife very uncomfortable because she is a small d and deep in her bones a Democrat in terms of, you know, the idea of the inequality of having a servant in the house. She never could get used to that, although she liked them very much. One did cooking and one did cleaning. That just sort of came with the territory, but it's very unlike the kind of life we have. And the little kids went to a school right down the street for a while, but what we had was I would do a report that would be on the evening news. I'd do a stand-up report. And it would go home and be shown on the evening news, and then the Pentagon would record this in what's called a kinescope. And then every week or so, the Pentagon would pile up a whole bunch of these stories and ship them by air on one big reel and run them in the public affairs office in a theater they had there. And you could go and watch your pieces and other pieces. And there'd be a brief introduction. They wouldn't do the whole newscast. They would just clip out what the anchorman was saying. We'd see ABC footage, NBC footage, and our own. And then the Armed Forces TV network, which was just for the soldiers, American troops in Vietnam, radio and television, they would run these things too. So at one point, my son is 10 years old, told me later, many years later, it really threw him when he's watching me on television and I walked in the door. He said, how did they do that? How did they ever do that? But that's the way the life was. My wife was pretty much confined to that place in Saigon and the general area.
So your wife didn't work?
Well, see, the Laos invasion happened. The Cambodian invasion happened, what it was. And that took me out of Saigon. There were many reporters who could live in Saigon and never leave. They could exist somehow and hand out information and whatever. But the people at CBS News were expected to go with the camera, with the troops.
With the troops.
No tripod, no lights, but camera, battery, and film. And our houses, we'd take little ponchos with us, that's your house. And you were expected to go and be in the jungle and be among the troops and report on what was going on.
How dangerous was that for you?
Well, there was no real way of knowing. I mean, when shooting starts, you don't know who's shooting. It's very, very frightening. Your whole system changes, everything adjusts. I got there on a Saturday and I was in a firefight on Monday. But I don't know, I still don't know to this day how many people were on the other side. It may have all been just, alarmist and you know, hysteria among these platoon leaders or something. I don't know. I know that we were shot at when we were in helicopters over Laos the following February or March, and that was very frightening because we could hear people with bigger guns shooting anti-aircraft, shooting at us. We were at 6,000 feet, and there's nothing you can do. In a firefight, at least you can duck behind a tree or try to get, you know, close to the ground. And there's nothing you can do in a helicopter. Just nothing. That was frightening. The most frightening thing that happened to me in Vietnam, though, was in the flood, because it lasted all afternoon. We were along the coast below Da Nang, several miles, 30 miles, 40 miles from Da Nang, and it had been raining for days and days and days, and the Little Red River just turned into the South China Sea. And we were on a road built, kind of like a causeway, built up, but running through among rice paddies. And all of a sudden this turned into a brown, white-capped sea with this horrible wind and rain. And I thought, well, we're just going to die here. It lasted for hours. And we were rescued by people like you in Chinooks. There were Marines flying, but there were Chinooks. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it's starting to get dark, and I'm thinking, oh, this is the end of everything. There's no communication. There are no cell phones. We're sharing a little rise in the road, which is a bridge over what was once a creek, with rats, snakes, the biggest millipedes you've ever seen. Ourselves, Vietnamese guys, a Japanese photographer whose friend had been killed in the morning, and he had never told us that his really close buddy had been killed in Cambodia that morning. He was just simply silent all day. We just thought he was a quiet guy. We didn't find all this out until later. But some big old Marine sergeant at the Da Nang Press Center looked at his watch and went to see the general. He said, "General, we've got a bunch of these guys missing." So he sent a Chinook to find us. They had been flying over our head all day, taking Vietnamese out of the flood. Thousands of Vietnamese were shifted during the flood to higher ground. But they came in around 5 or 5:30, and I can still remember that. Every bit of it, the sight of it, the smell of it, the sound of it, that ramp coming down. Holy Jesus. We left our vehicles and just got in the Chinook and tried to go get dry. But I can still remember what a terrible fright that was.
Now, were you permitted to carry personal weapons at all?
No, you can't do that. Not if you're a reporter. Not if you're a journalist. In the first place, you're so busy. What the hell are you going to do with this extra piece of equipment? We didn't bother to carry tripods, so why would we carry a gun? But two, you can't take part. You just cannot take part. I saw guys who did that, but they were from, you know, obscure little news services that didn't mean anything. If CBS News executives heard that you did that, you'd be on a plane home. You'd have a serious discussion and probably be looking for work. You just cannot do that.
Okay.
Cannot do that.
Now, when you were in Saigon, were you ever under any sort of attack, or your family? Were they ever in any sort of danger?
Well, the danger you're talking about is after we moved out. We were on the way out in December of '70. My wife was going to take the kids home, and I was going to fly with her as far as Europe and then come back. And then for 2 weeks, we moved out of the apartment, which was about a mile from the office, off of a main drag called Kang Li. And the apartment was at the bottom of a building that housed U.S. officers, a BOQ. And we moved into the hotel, right across the street from the office, downtown, the famous hotel. And right after we moved out, the place was bombed. It was just blown to smithereens. The apartment, not the building. And some people said, well, it's the Viet Cong trying to kill officers in the building. But other people said, no, it's a family thing. Somebody has a grudge against the lady who owned the building. It was the landlady, and she was really tough. She was really a hard nose. It might have been one or the other, I don't know. But I was attacked and out in front of the office in a park, in front of the legislature, when some Vietnamese came out to demonstrate against the war, which was almost unheard of. We went out to shoot that, and the police beat us up.
Did they take your camera equipment?
They tried to. Couldn't do it. No, we had some really tough people looking for us. Yeah. A guy from ABC was a friend of mine, was hit in the head with a tear gas grenade. It's this thing that shoots out of a big fat barrel. Doesn't go but 50 feet, but he was about 10 feet away from the guy. So it really knocked him over. Well, that's the kind of stuff that they would do. But Saigon, the family was there in a period, it was a kind of a gap. Before that, there'd been rockets into the city. And after that, I guess there were. But in this period from 70 to My wife was there for 6 months in 1970, June to December, and yeah, about that. In that period, Saigon was relatively peaceful.
Now, what about your daily existence as far as food and meals? Did you eat from the local economy, or did you buy from the PX? Or?
There's a PX, and we were given PX privileges. So the company would send a driver over. My wife would go up, maybe sometime with another one of the wives. But maybe she would just take the kids and go to a supermarket, and then you drive home, put the stuff in the house. We often ate out for dinner, and then I was away from the house most of the time. Why my wife wanted to go home, because I was away most of the time. So I would eat Army food. I would eat sea rations in the field, and go to Army bases. If we were staying at the base at night. The U.S. Army, I don't know if other armies are like this, but they're very generous with journalists. They'll take you someplace.
I was going to ask you that, how you were treated by the GIs.
Most of the time, you could get a ride in a truck or a helicopter or a C-130 or other plane like that. There was a time when up in Da Nang, all this stuff was going on up in I Corps, 400 miles or more from Saigon, when one of the Vietnamese soundmen's wife became very, very sick. And one of the correspondents approached a general who said, "Oh, here, take my Scout back," which is a little jet, like a Learjet, and shipped the guy to Saigon. I mean, these are people, many of whom hated the reporting we were doing, but were still very generous to us. Now, some people did hate us, but if you went down a line of chopper pilots, say a whole bunch of Hueys, and guys were just sitting around, the rotors were tied down, and they were waiting for orders for something. And if you walked up to them, 5 out of 10 guys would say, "Yeah, can I hop in?" 2 out of 3 would ignore you, and 2 out of 3 would tell you to go jump in the lake. But people would give you a ride. During the Battle of Khe Sanh, the later fight, not the Marines, but when the 1st to the 5th Army MEC, 1st to the 5th MEC Army Division was at Khe Sanh in 71, supporting the South Vietnamese Army's invasion of Laos. It was just nothing but cold and mud. I didn't know Vietnam could be so damn cold. But we were up there, and people were very, very gentle. We rode out every day. We got up in the morning in a barracks, had a nice Army chow for breakfast, and as soon as it was light enough or clear enough for we were to fly, we'd just go find a chopper. I was in a chopper once with 17 people in it, a Huey. There's 17 news guys in it. And the pilots were taking an awful lot of chances in terms of just the terrain and the weather. I mean, it was very dangerous just for that. And then on the top of that, people shoot at it. But we would just go out there and get off in Khe Sanh. Thanks a lot. We had no idea how we were going to get back. We had no idea how long we were going to stay there. We had no idea what we were going to shoot. But we got off one day and walked right into the middle of a mutiny of Army troops. I didn't know it. I walked right through these guys. And there's some shooting down the road. We could take care of this. They were in the midst of mutiny, of a mutiny against their colonel who was in a chopper. And picked up on it later and did a story. Finally got caught on to what was happening. But I mean, you would get to Khe Sanh and you wouldn't know what you were going to do that day. And you would do what you did. You could find something, because everything was going on. There was all kinds of shooting and firing and blah, 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 this and that. And then either you stayed out there, like you just huddled in some tent or something, or you went back on an evening chopper, got your nice shower and chow and nice warm barracks bed, and got up in the morning, did the same thing next day. And there was just a little bit of war every day for a couple of hours. And got to know some guys on the ground, stayed with them in their barracks, and sort of like covered, almost like being embedded, but it was unofficial. Just hung around with the same people. The Army was very open then, but that's changed because there were too many what the Pentagon thought were bad stories. So they sent all the majors and the captains to these various schools they have and said, "Don't let anything like this happen again. Get control of that camera and keep it away from the bad news." There's a wonderful film of a guy named Jones who's wounded slightly in the leg. And he's lying back and he's being tended to and he's smoking a cigarette. And a reporter's voice is asking him questions. The film is on his face and he's wincing. Oh, he's hurt. And he's talking. And the reporter's voice is very clearly that of Charles Kuralt, with a very distinctive, deep, fluid voice, very authoritative. And he's asking questions. And this goes on for, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes. And this guy is wounded, and he's going, something about his mother, and something about his head, and something about that. And you haven't seen anything like that from Afghanistan or Iraq that I know of. Why? Well, in the first invasion of Iraq, the Bush War of 91 or 2, whatever it was, the reporters and cameras were all in Riyadh, 400 miles away. It's like covering the Super Bowl in Dallas from Chicago. You get a feed. You sit in a room with a feed, and some majors are in charge of that. And the present war, I don't know what it's like. I just would love to go over and cover that to see what it is like. But we had unlimited access to everything. Now, where you were at Fubai, we did get arrested one time for being on the base. But this was a little bit later in the process. They were beginning to catch on. But generally they couldn't arrest and round us up. We were in another country. We're wandering around, and we could hook up with troops. If troops were friendly to us, we were friendly. We could get in with them and do stuff that drove them mad. But now they don't want this. They control. They make sure. And I think it's breaking a bond. Here in this museum, you have all these pictures of the Civil War. Reporters have been with American troops in the very front lines, standing right amongst the fighting, ever since the Civil War. And I think this business of the Bush administration, and then later the war in Iraq and Afghanistan the second time around, I think that breaks this bond. I think reporters are not real reporters unless they're really there. I mean, if you're going to be a cop reporter, you got to go to the crime scene and slip in the blood. Okay, there's blood on the floor, you have to get in there and slip in it. If you're going to report on AIDS, well, you got to go into the little home that I went into right outside of Albany here, where all of the AIDS victims are babies. There's a home that's probably still there, run by these wonderful people. They made us wash our hands when we went in there with a camera crew from ABC. This was much later. And we said, why are we washing your hands? Are you afraid we'll catch something? No, we're afraid they'll catch something from you. These were children who were not going to live for past age 6 or so. But how are you going to do that sitting at home or on the phone with some nurse? No, you have to go there. And in this case, you have to go. And I'm sorry that we don't go. I'm sorry that there aren't more reporting. I've seen some wonderful television reporting on 60 Minutes of Scott Pelley going with units. And he's all, with the flak and the helmet. He is with that unit. I think that's the right thing to do. I don't know to what extent the Pentagon is able to control what he asks, what he hears. I just don't know. I don't know. I'd love to know.
I know in today's military, every unit or battalion has a public affairs officer, and I know that the soldiers are kind of restricted as to what they can comment on and what they can't. They have to basically get permission first to comment.
And see, to me, that sounds like the Chinese army or the Russian army. Before you open your mouth. But Americans, we're here to tell each other what we think about things, aren't we? I mean, that's one of the definitions here. And I'm sorry about that. I really am sorry about that. Now, they did try to tell troops, and I think this is perfectly legitimate. If you're going to talk to somebody, just talk about what you know. Don't talk about... S.L.A. Marshall, the famous general, wrote a piece about this. Why have a Spec 4 discussing policy to North Vietnamese, the bombing of Haiphong Harbor? Fair enough. But if you're not going to let the Spec 4 tell me what he felt that day, what he is doing at this minute, if he just, feels like he's going to die out here, well, then that's what they don't want. They don't want. They don't want Kuralt or anybody else interviewing Sergeant Jones when he's just been hit. They just don't want that. And that's a shame.
Did you, when you were in Vietnam, did you encounter, you mentioned the one mutiny, but what about racial problems? Did you ever?
Racial problems were enormous. There are 2 officers who were majors, who were teaching over here in Vermont, who wrote a book called Crisis in Command after the war, or as the war was Gabriel and Savage were their names, as a matter of fact. They studied records of officer murder. In Vietnam, officer murder was fragging. I don't know what it was in the Korean War or what it was in World War II, but you can probably count a handful of those. In those, count 269 combat refusals in 1 year in Vietnam that these guys reported on in 1 calendar year. And I don't know what, I can't remember which year, but they went back majors. These 2 guys are majors, and then they showed up as academics at St. Anselm's College in Vermont. And they reviewed the records. And we had enormous amounts of fragging. I remember one guy named Billy Smith who got off. He threw hand grenades in to where his lieutenant of his platoon and a sergeant were sleeping. And they had traded places with some others. Well, that was routine, to trade places each night for a lieutenant, his own men, because of the racial problems were really the source of a lot of this. But there were also leadership problems you know, it really came from the top. For example, the mutiny that I witnessed outside Quezon, the colonel was in a chopper. Now, when American soldiers go to war, the colonel is supposed to be like on a horse leading with a sword or something like that, not far away. One of the things that they study in this book, they'll show you little charts of American troops in war, the ratio of enlisted to officer dead. How many enlisted dead, how many officer dead. And all the wars have got the same relationships until you get to Vietnam and everything changes. There are very few officer dead compared to enlisted. And the troops understand this. It's the first thing they learn. Holy cow, I'm out here, but where's he? You know, he's in a chopper. He's back at some base. You know, he's just not out here sharing this. And you have to share the burden. You have to be an equal share. You have to be. They also have little charts on the number of casualties, and that's different. Yeah, yeah. And they knew that. The guys knew that.
Now, did you do very many stories on the South Vietnamese Army?
I started to, but my friend, a cameraman, an Australian by the name of Norman Lloyd, who had just come over there, he and I worked together a lot. You didn't marry. You didn't have the same cameraman every time. Cameraman didn't have the same correspondent every time, but you did sometimes a lot of stuff together. But I worked with all the others. I worked with, my first month or two over there, I worked with a cameraman named Pham Boy Wan, PB1 as he was known. He lives in Virginia now, has for a long time, raised his family there. But there were other cameramen. There was another guy from Australia, and there were some really terrific guys from America too. But Norman is the guy who told me when I was suggesting that he and I go together and do a story in the Vietnamese. He said, forget it. Forget the Vietnamese. He said, you're here for an American audience, and no one in America cares what happens to that army. Although I saw some lovely pieces. Before I went there, one of the important producers in New York called me up on the phone and said, listen, go, I was in the Los Angeles Bureau. He said, go in the tape department back there and get the guy to play for you a such and such piece done by somebody so-and-so recently on my show. And I went and looked at this, was a 3 or 4 or 5 minute piece that one of my colleagues had done on a South Vietnamese soldier. Followed him all the way through, read his love letters from home, you know, interviewed his sweetheart and his mother. And it was a very nice piece, but it was all about a South Vietnamese guy. And I got over there and I realized, you know, when others told me, you should be doing stories about Americans. So we pretty much hung around with American troops.
And how did you dress over there? Did you wear like an American uniform or a military type uniform?
Well, there's a little manual that has uniforms for people in it, including, you can turn to a page that says correspondence uniform. And it's a U.S. Army uniform, and it has your name one side here, and over here, instead of Spec 4 or whatever it says correspondent or press or something like that. There's a little thing on your shoulder that says that. We didn't do any of that. We went and got the uniforms in the black market, right outside the office. Walked down the street to the next block with a Vietnamese guy who can talk to the vendor, and you haggle over the price, and you buy a pair of pants, and you buy one of those tunics, shirt, whatever you call it, and some boots, and some socks. And that's all you need. You can buy a helmet, you can buy a flak jacket or any of that. So
you basically blended in with the GIs you were going out on patrol with.
Except for hair. This was 1970 and 71, and the fashion was to wear hair long. and I had my hair medium long, a little bit, and it would freak out. It would freak out a lifer.
Mm-hmm.
You'd be in a mess hall. I stopped some colonels from eating their meal. The guy's got a tray and he comes over, and I was entitled to officer. We had something like the equivalent of major status.
Mm-hmm.
When Mike Wallace came over, he had the equivalent of full colonel or whatever was the next one up,
Brigadier
something. He had that status because he was Mike Wallace. But we often wear TV suits. There was a tailor right around the corner from the office who did the TV. If you remember what we looked like in those days, it was a civilian outfit, all
Mm-hmm.
one color, made to fit your size. So we did a lot of that too. The old films will show guys in TV suits. But we had the privilege to eat in the officer's mess. And I would just go in there and get my cornflakes and stuff. But I can remember eating alone in the officer's mess. And I remember a guy coming by with a tray and stop and saying, this is down in the Delta somewhere, who the hell are you? And it just freaked him out that first I hadn't washed very much. I'd been out in some kind
Mm-hmm.
of helicopter wash and I'd gotten stuff all over me and stuff. And I was really messy and really ugly and looking the opposite from, a clean cut guy. And as soon as I said CBS News, he just, "Ooh!" I mean, it was frightening him to see somebody in his mess hall that looked so weird. Yeah, that got us in trouble sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hippies. I remember once my wife and I went with this fellow, Norman Lloyd, and a couple of Vietnamese. We were in Cam Bay, and we stayed in the BOQ overnight. We came down in the morning, there was a bulletin board, and there was a notice put on the bulletin board, because we were from CBS. CBS equals Communist Bullshit Society. So we didn't have our fans. You know where we went to get the absolute truth about everything? Young doctors. Go into a medical evac area, go into the hospital,
Mm-hmm.
talk to young doctors. Young doctors were there because they had made a deal with the government, and they didn't give a damn if anybody wanted to throw them out of the service. They would be very delighted. They owed the government so much service,
Mm-hmm.
and their service was to make wounded people better. Tie up stuff, sew up stuff, and get them going. And they didn't care. They would tell you the truth. They didn't have anybody. I mean, there were senior doctors who were very much lifer guys. But matter of fact, I got in the hospital, and I was in there for about 12 days in Da Nang, and one of the guys that came around was the head of the hospital. He was an older doctor, and he was really freaked out by the fact that I didn't have a regulation haircut. But and he would come around and do some insulting, and then walk off. But the younger doctors were much more open to telling you what was really going on. They didn't have any of the pressure to lie about things that so many other people had. So many people had.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorites is a guy named Terry I worked with at CBS News in the late 70s, long after I'd been back from Vietnam. He'd been a bomber pilot off of a carrier. And he told us about how when they came back, they were supposed to turn in a BDA. You know what a BDA is, bomb damage assessment, or battle damage assessment, one of the two. And he would fly toward Vietnam and then drop all of his bombs in the water, fly around for a while, and then come home, because he didn't want to hurt anybody. So when he came back, he landed, he'd go in and fill out this sheet. And he said that he thought up things that he had destroyed. And he would put down that he had destroyed an enemy bomb crater storage area. It's where the enemy was keeping bomb craters. And he would bomb them, and he would write about it. And then he said that the next day, the carrier assembled all the BDAs into one big BDA, and his bomb crater storage areas had turned into tanks, and artillery, ammunition depots, and all this stuff, which has all been, this is one great, as you probably know, it's been one giant lie.
Mm-hmm. I imagine you must have covered some pretty sad or heart-wrenching stories too over there.
Yeah, a large group of American soldiers, all young kids, killed in one rocket attack. One rocket came into a place which was like a rec hall, and it was a bunker.
Mm-hmm.
It was twice the size of this room, huge room, and they had packed all manner of wood and steel and soil on top of this to make a roof impervious to and one North Vietnamese rocket, excuse me, came through all this and blew up and killed a whole bunch of guys. I don't know how to remember. And then on another, this is all up toward the northern part of South Vietnam. As I was coming over here thinking about this, I was remembering 96 bodies of young boys, North Vietnamese boys, laid out in a little bit of a depression in the ground, like a dry canal or a trench, laid out in order, like you'd line up a bunch of pencils or something. 96 bodies. I can still see them. I can still see them. And they had been killed in various battle and the day before, but just left there. Just left there. But there are many things like that. You start thinking about back 40 years ago, right?
Were any of your stories maybe not shown because they might have been too graphic? Or
sometimes pictures, as they are today, sometimes pictures are edited out, but not the story. I never had any story blocked. And some reporters did stuff where the colonel would try to get things fixed up at the Pentagon. It just never worked. Not at CBS News. CBS News people were very unresponsive to government pressure. Excuse me, I can't remember which president it was. Nixon wanted Dan Rather fired. How far do you think that got? No. Sometimes pictures were so bloody, and that'll happen tomorrow in an American crime story. Yeah. Excuse me, can we stop?
Sure. Were any of your coworkers injured or maybe even killed?
Yes.
Working as correspondents?
Yes. And I found that very frightening. I had stopped smoking. My wife had stopped, and I had stopped smoking. And I started on the way over on the plane. They fly you over first class because of where you're going. And the Japan Airlines had wonderful coffee, and they had little packs of cigarettes, 4 cigarettes in a little sample pack. So I lit those up on the way over because I'm reading this story about guys I'm about to be in the same group with, the same office with, who had cameras shot out of their hands. Dana Stone, who died, and this is in March, I'm on my way over there, he was dead by May or June. Dana Stone was a young, wiry, real tough guy, who was palled with one of Errol Flynn's sons, maybe Errol Flynn's only son, Sean Flynn. And they had little scooters. And they went out during the invasion of Cambodia, which was May of '71, the one where Kissinger said we're not bombing. And they went out on their own as freelancers. Sort of an association of CBS News, but not exactly the full imprimatur of the company. They weren't paid staff. They didn't have, well, they may have had some identification. But anyway, they went driving out, but they were on their own. They were not with American troops. See, that's where you want to be. The safest place to be in a big fight like that, to me, is American troops. Because if you get hurt, they're going to get you to a hospital faster than anybody in the world. Because that's what they do. And they're very proud of the fact that they'll go in any fire situation and get you wounded people out. They don't care who you are. They'll get you out of there. Well, these guys went off on their own, and they were captured by the Khmer Rouge, and they were almost immediately murdered. At the same time, they were on their little scooters in one part of Vietnam or Cambodia, north of Saigon. At the same time, a group left Phnom Penh. Jerry Sievertson, Jerry Miller, producer, George Sievertson, was a correspondent, and a whole group of others, a driver, translator, and Wells Hangan of NBC, were all in a little group coming out of Phnom Penh, and they were in Cambodia, and they were arrested by the Khmer Rouge, taken out of their little vehicles, which were like open, low Jeeps called mini-mokes, almost like gasoline-powered golf carts, really. Taken out of there and walked a few yards into the woods and all shot, and left bodies there. And for years, people have been trying to find the bodies. Kurt Volker wrote a book about trying to find the bodies of Sievertson, because he worked with Sievertson. Wrote about that. So this happened right after I got there, and there were quite a number of news people, cameramen, and photographers, still photographers, sound men, correspondents, and producers who were killed covering the Vietnam War. Many have been killed covering the Iraq-Afghanistan wars too. I realize that, and of course an awful lot in Bosnia. But Vietnam certainly had its share of journalists killed. Much larger proportion than, say, the Army deaths are. Although there were 60,000 U.S. Army and maybe 2 million Vietnamese Army and civilians were killed in that war.
Now, when did you end up leaving?
I ended up leaving in about July of '71, after the invasion of Laos sort of wound down, and went home to Atlanta. Got a new assignment in Atlanta.
Were you summoned back, or was your time up over there?
You had a choice. You had a choice if you worked for one of the American networks.
You had like a tour of duty?
You could go for 6 months and come home. Or, if you wanted to take a tax advantage, at that time there was some law that said something like, out of 500 days out of the country, if you're home for no more than 10 or 20 of those days, you don't have to pay any taxes on the first 20,000 or the second 20, something of your income. And it was worth it to me, not just for that tax advantage, which I didn't understand then fully the numbers, nor do I understand it now, but to me it was kind of silly just to go over for 6 months, because you're just not, I'm not getting my stride for 2 months. I got over there for 7 weeks, I wasn't even on the air. And people were beginning to wonder where I was doing, where I was, what was going on. But then I began to get, and to me you'd have to be there for a year or more. And as I look back on it now, I think it would have been better to spend, most of your career there, to be there, as some guys were for 5 or 10 years, because it was the big story. I mean, especially if you went over there, not in 1970 as I did, but if you went over there in '63 or '64, when Peter Kalisher of CBS News was one of the few television people there, that would have been smart to like just set up life there and buy a house and live there, I think.
So you came back home. Did you experience some of the things that GIs would experience going back home? I mean, like maybe the post-traumatic stress, or being in a combat zone one day and being back in the world the next day.
Well, it was a big, as they called it in those days, culture shock, to go from Saigon to Atlanta, Georgia. That was a big change. Nothing murderous in that. A lot of guys went home and said they got spit on at the airport and stuff like that. That didn't happen to me. But the most disappointing thing was that nobody wanted to hear my story. This was my war. My big brother had gone into the Merchant Marine in the Second World War. He was in the U.S. Army during Korea. My father had been in the First World War in the infantry. And I thought, well, this is my war. I wasn't in on any of those, but I'm on, and this is my war. But nobody wanted to hear anything. Nobody. Americans were so ashamed of Vietnam that they didn't want to hear it. And even anything like, how long were you there? And they just want to turn away from it. Well, once in a while, I was working for CBS out of Atlanta, and so I was in the South. Same kind of traveling, away from home all the time. Same kind of traveling 8 days a week. So I got to know the downtown of Jacksonville, Florida, Jackson, Mississippi, Memphis, Miami. I got to know the downtown, and where the Western Union office was, where the local affiliate was, everything. I got to know all that better than Atlanta, where I lived. So I was traveling a lot, but I can remember in Tallahassee, I was at the airport, and a guy came up to me and said, hey, stuck out his hand. He said, I just want to thank you for telling the truth about Vietnam. And once in a great while, you'd get that. But otherwise, most people didn't want to know, And there's a thing about this that's developed since this time that I find to be a great mystery. The war was very unpopular. A lot of people were roughly treated when they got them. Soldiers say they were spit on if they were in uniform. And things like that. I understand that. But what I don't understand is that it's reported that there are thousands of men in America walking around now who were never anywhere near Vietnam, who say they were. Like these guys running for office. The fellow in Connecticut, Blumenthal, who ran for office. I guess he won. But he put it down when he was never there. And then he later said, oh, that was a lapse. That's a hell of a lapse. But why? Why are people going around saying, is that phenomenon also apparent during or after the Second World War? Did guys lie about that? Or is this the weirdest war we were ever in? I mean, are there going to be guys lying about it in the next few years about Afghanistan, saying I was there when all the time they were in Brooklyn or Springfield, Illinois? I mean, who knows? Yeah. To me, I don't know where you get the answer to this. I don't know what the sociologists are going to figure out, why that has been the case.
I don't know. Sometimes I think maybe it's a sense of guilt. Maybe they want to be looked upon as some sort of war hero.
Yeah.
I mean, especially if they're running for political office. I mean, it looks good on a resume that they were in a combat zone. I don't know.
That's one mystery. Here's another one. Throughout the history of the Prussian and the French and the German and the British armies, there are many cases where officers, feeling that the army was doing something wrong, would resign in protest. We have a total of one in Vietnam. One officer resigning against a war which was completely wrong. I mean, we knew then, a lot of people knew then, officers were being lied to. Mm-hmm. They were lying to their superiors and on up the line until the guy was lying to the president, who was lying to himself. This is all goofy. I mean, it's like something from Alice in Wonderland. And only one officer in the whole war. 60,000 Americans killed, years of war, 2 million Vietnamese killed, countless billions of dollars spent blowing people up, and the Agent Orange and all that. And we only got one guy. Just in Agent Orange itself, no one resigned. No one saw the poisoning of a whole landscape, the poisoning of generations of Vietnamese, and said, I protest, I resign. What's the matter? What is that? It's a mystery. Another mystery. I mean to come here and saddle you with mysteries. That's not the job here.
Now, speaking of diseases like Agent Orange, were you ever knowingly exposed to that?
Not that I know of. Mm-hmm. Not that I know of. I got malaria.
I was going to ask you
when we were up near Marble Mountain. North Vietnamese were thick. I was out with a unit of Marines just outside Da Nang. Mm-hmm. And it was very jovial and friendly. It was very dark at night. We were just standing around smoking cigarettes with the young major who had a combat operation going on a few hundred yards away. And he had called in artillery on his own. They were so close together to the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese. These were not Viet Cong, North Vietnamese, who often went into battle, hundreds of men at a time, all with the acute symptoms of malaria, mm-hmm. which is shaking, paleness, barfing, just, you feel horrible. How they could pick up weapons and go into battle, I don't know. But the guy is calling the artillery, and little pieces of metal are landing in our hats and on our shoulders, not hurting us, but the little pieces of shrapnel. I thought this was remarkable. I've never been on anything like this before. But we're standing around talking about things, talking about the mine dogs and the other dogs they used, and we had a little tent here. And then a bunch of us went in there and just all lay down together in this tent, and I could feel mosquitoes biting me through my socks, and I sprayed some of that stuff on the mm-hmm. socks. But 2 weeks later, I came down. That's where I got it. I got it that night, and we were right beside Marble Mountain, which is a distinctive hunk of geography mm-hmm. Outside of Da Nang. And 2 weeks later, I was in that hospital, the same hospital that the television show China Beach was sort of modeled after, something or other evac hospital. And I can remember wonderful doctors and wonderful nurses and very strange cases of this and that and the other in this big ward. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I got really, really sick. I got really sick.
Do you suffer from the effects of malaria today?
I don't know. I have spells of illness that could be diabetes, it could be malaria, I don't know. Mm-hmm. I've been to various doctors, I've never gotten any straight answer.
Were you given any sort of preventative, I forget what they were called now, but I remember...
Why not? They're prophylactic pills, they're supposed to prevent malaria.
Right. They had another name though. I remember when we were over there, it was a big orange pill you took once a week.
It was a big brown or orange pill, and it was quinine essentially, and it made mm-hmm. me sick. So sick I couldn't take it, so I didn't take mm-hmm. it. And I thought, I'll get away with it. And I took a chance and I lost. Mm-hmm. There are two main types of malaria, and I got them both. And for years I've had these whatever, but let's figure that, it's part of the game. It's just part of the thing you buy. What am I going to do, stay home, mm-hmm. sell insurance? I mean, what the hell?
Yeah. Now, working for CBS, did you cover any other news stories overseas? Were you stationed, like say in Europe? Or?
No, I was never stationed. I did go over to Tehran mm-hmm. when the hostages were taken. I did have a spell over there for a couple of weeks during that thing, and I did.
What was that like over there?
That was real hatred. You went out on the streets and people would just glare at you because you were an American. Yeah, that was weird. A little bit tense, but it was kind of mostly weird. There was that, and I did a few other things. I can't remember anything overseas other than that. I mean, there were some trips. You'd follow some dignitary on a trip. Mondale had a very interesting trip that we took. I was assigned to cover him. He was vice president, and I was assigned to cover that.
Did you fly on Air Force One? Or?
Yes. Air Force One, Air Force Two, yeah, things like that. Did those things. That's not really an overseas assignment. And that's not much fun, covering the president. I did a lot of stuff, Jerry Ford trips and Carter trips and stuff like that, and Mondale trips, and even some Reagan. But that's not really reporting. I mean, you got 50 or 100 reporters, but they're all absolutely controlled. They get on a certain bus. You can't get off that bus and wander around because the bus is going to go someplace else, and all your controllers are all there.
Now, did you ever experience questions you had for the president or the vice president? They'd have to be reviewed before you could ask them?
No. They are much more subtle than that. They're much more subtle. They couldn't get away with that. They couldn't come into your little cubicle and say, I want to see what you're going to ask the president. There would be a terrible row about that. But they can figure out what you're going to ask. And they spend a lot of time figuring out what they're going to be asked. And they do that right now. Darn right do that. And then they figure out what they're going to not say. And there is a large industry. This is a very large and expensive industry of teaching people, not just presidents and senators, but corporate officials especially, what not to say. How to stick with a message and not wander off the message where you could get killed. And this industry of teaching includes a lot of video experience, a lot of actual video from the field of a corporate leader getting up and getting in trouble in front of a crowd. And these are news clips from 15, 20 years ago of a guy standing in front of a crowd. For example, this corporate leader in West Virginia. They had a plant explosion. They're poisoning the air, poisoning the water, kind of like a West Virginia version of Bhopal. And this guy is at a town meeting. And there are 200 or 300 people in the room. They're all mad as hell. And he says all the wrong things. So you run this, and you show Mr. Corporate Executive here who's spending $10,000 a day being taught. And you say, see that? Don't say that. Here's what you say instead. Here's a little card. It's called staying on message. There's a big industry of this. And the U.S. government is, very careful about different interest groups. You want the vice president to say so. Walter Mondale is an absolute expert in not answering questions. He's as good as anybody today.
When did you end up retiring?
Well, I suppose that'll come along soon. I'm still doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
You're still...
Well, not television so much. You get too old for television, and you get ugly. They only want beautiful. If you look on television now, and I see...
Well, look at Walter Cronkite.
Well, look at Walter Cronkite, but then you look at Channel 9 in Washington in the morning when you tune in to get the weather. There's some gorgeous thing there. CNN, they're all gorgeous females.
Like that all over.
Yeah. So I figure I'll become, doctors at Hopkins can do this. I'll become a gorgeous female, and then I'll get back in television. No, I do some things. I have an article appearing in 3 weeks in a magazine that my daughter took the pictures and I wrote it. Not a magazine you've ever heard of, but what the hell. We're still doing a little things like that. But I really finished with television, I guess a couple of years ago. I haven't really done anything lately. I'll be 74 in May of 2011.
Is there anything you'd like to add that maybe we missed or didn't touch on? Any final words?
Let me just tell you about the difference between NBC and CBS.
Sure.
There's a man at Northwestern named Larry Lichty, who is the only person in America who interviewed just about every correspondent for all three networks who went to Saigon and spent any time there at all. And that's about 100 guys. And for NBC, this was a starting assignment. You were hired like George Lewis out of an affiliate in San Diego, and your first job was Saigon. Bang. of about 25 NBC correspondents who went to Saigon in this period, half of them ended up losing their jobs at the network. A corresponding 25 number of guys at CBS News were looked at by the company for 2 or 3 years or more before they were allowed to go to Vietnam. They were scrutinized by producers in New York who watched their work and said, okay, so-and-so, they wanted to understand whether they could rely on you.
Mm-hmm.
Of those 25, only one lost his job at the network by, say, 1975 or 80, when Lichty was doing this study. Only one. Because they knew who went there. They knew what they were like. Very few came back. Still reporters. Most got their little correspondent stripe when most who went over there. It was a completely different way of approaching the war. Now, of the 3 networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, Lichty also found that in the case of 2 of those networks, almost all of the correspondents went with a certain feeling about the war and came back feeling against the war more than they went there. Either they were for the war when they went there,
Mm-hmm.
and they came back less in favor of the war, or they were in the middle either way but came back against the war, or they went there against the war and came back more against the war. So that in 2 of the networks, in the other network, and Lichty never named the networks, he said they were the other way.
Hmm.
They just, they went over and more or less in support of the war and came back more hawkish than they were. He never told me which ones, but you can guess just like I can guess.
Mm-hmm. Now you put together an album. You want to tell us about that?
Several people did that. Not available in bookstores. This was for a reunion of CBS News people, not just correspondents, but people, soundmen, drivers. One guy took 5 buses from Oregon to get to this. He was one of the soundmen. He's dead now, Mr. Jean. Here's Ed Bradley. He's dead now. We had household names. We had most of our bosses. We had drivers and soundmen and everybody come to this in 2000, 25 years after the fall of Saigon. This was in April of 2000. In the DC area.
Mm-hmm.
We had a cocktail party one night, we had a dinner one night, and we had a brunch on the following Sunday. It's Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday. And for this, several of us were involved in this. We asked everybody who was coming to send us something to put in the book in the way of writing. And most people, well, here are the 3 people who put it together, plus my daughter Lily and my wife Jill helped with this. But we asked people to send stuff, and they sent copy. Here's send a story. One guy sent a few words, and one guy sent 6,000 words. And these are their stories. I haven't seen this book in a long time.
I noticed there's some wonderful photographs in there too, the different correspondents.
We put those together. We asked them to send not only copy, but we asked them to send a picture, and we'll put it in here. And sure, here they are. Boy, these guys are a lot younger. Here's one of the guys who ran the shop in New York. Same guy, Russ Bensley. He was the person who looked at your stuff. But see, there's a guy at home sitting in his fat chair on his fat ass, and he never bothers. But here's a guy from CBS News. He's one of the biggest bosses in the company. He runs the Cronkite show. Really, well, Walter ran the show, but this is guy, and he's out there. He got badly wounded, by the way, on this operation. And here he is in retirement. Yeah. I mean, you can work for a guy like that.
Mm-hmm.
If he sends you a cable from New York, and you know that he's been there, and he sends you a cable, you can really respect that. Here's a guy who was, as soon as the Khmer Rouge took over in Saigon, he was murdered by the Khmer Rouge.
And who was that?
His name is Put Sopan. Put, P-U-T, last name S-O-P-H-A-N. He was buddies with the more famous American Cambodian guy, Diet Pran, who ended up working for the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
And Put Sopan and Diet Pran had gone to school together. And they were on their way over to the Khmer Rouge. They'd been summoned for questioning. And Diet Pran says, don't tell him you worked for the Americans. I'm not. I'm going to tell him I was something, something, something. and puts up and says, oh, I went to school with those guys too. I know them. They know me. It's going to be fine. And 15 minutes later, he was dead.
I think Dith Prawn said he was a taxi driver.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that. And Norman, who was the guy I was telling you about, is right next to him. Norman has since been organizing to try to send some money to put Sopan's widow. And it's difficult because he's in California, the widow is in Cambodia, and there are people along the way who could, and would, he says, take the money away. On its way to them, you know, circa 2000, circa 2011, and so on. God, here's a great picture of Morley Safer.
It was the one where he's soaking his feet.
Yeah. Now, the guy I told you about who was killed over there, right after I got there, is this fellow, Sievertson, George Sievertson. He was an interesting story because Sievertson and his wife spoke Polish fluently. And they would get on the telephone. He's out in the field and she's in Saigon and talk to each other on the telephone. And they would always speak in Polish because they knew if there were any Army, U.S. Army, or U.S. intelligence people listening, they would have a hell of a time in Polish. Gustav Sievertson. So I think she's still alive and in New York. And it's a terrible shame. He wasn't like killed in action. He was simply taken out of a car and murdered.